Hello, everyone. Hello again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the globe. My name is Eran Neumann. I'm the Dean of the Yolanda and David Katz Faculty of the Arts at Tel Aviv University, and I'm glad to open our second meeting in the second series of conversations between leading international scholars and intellectuals and our faculty members. We're honored to have with us today Professor Saskia Sassen of Columbia University from New York City. Professor Sassen is located in London right now. She will converse with Talia Marglit from the Israeli School of Architecture on urbanism, protest, and democracy. Talia will introduce Professor Sassen shortly, but let me elaborate a little bit about our series. The title of this series is Art, Protest, and Democracy. In the 4 talks, and as I said, this is the second one, we will explore the continuous debates about the role played by art, film, theater, architecture, and urbanism in preventing and defending democracy. Over the past few decades, we have witnessed changes in the ways in which democracy is conceptualized and practiced, and seen how this process has led to the worrisome weakening of democracies around the world. Regimes in Africa, Europe and Asia have become, also North America have become more deeply nationalist and authoritarian, eroding democratic values and depriving people of the most basic human rights. Faced with the global pandemic, the notion of democracy is being further challenged as leaders worldwide enforce restrictive new rules and regulations under the rubric of state of emergency, which accelerates and institutionalizes these processes. This situation raises numerous questions, including how should artists, architects, urbanists, and researchers respond to the assault on democracy? How does it affect architecture and urbanism? What is the place of digital and social media in the arts and in sustaining democracy? Should and how can the arts participate in the discussion on democracy today, and will it make any difference? I truly hope that we will be able to shed some light on these important questions during the series of compelling conversation. And now I'm happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Talia Marglit. Architect Talia Marglit is the head of the master program at the David Israeli School of Architecture in Tel Aviv University. Her research focuses on Israeli urban planning, specifically on planning communications, urban citizenship struggles, and public-private projects. She completed a research on planning objections and justifications, and is now conducting a wide-angle research on Israeli planning in the media, both funded by the Israeli Science Foundation. She authored several books, chapters, and published in several journals, among them Urban Studies, Environment and Planning A, Cities, Planning Theory and Practice, Journal of Urban and Regional Research, among others. She and her students founded Meirim, an Israeli online platform for planning, democracy, and communication. Talia?
Hi, good evening. I hope everybody can hear me well. I'm honored to present Professor Saskia Sassen, Robert Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University and a member of the Columbia Committee on Global Thought, one of the world's leading authorities on globalization. Professor Sassen is a highly acclaimed scholar and a main figure in international academic and public discourses on cities and states, immigration, inequality, gendering, and digitation. Professor Sassen has published extensively, and her books are translated into many languages. They include, among others, Cities and World Economy, The Global City, A Sociology of Globalization, Territory, Authority, Rights, and the latest Exclusion, Brutality, and Complexity in the Global Economy. In addition, she contributes regularly to Open Democracy and the Huffington Post. Our webinar will proceed with a short lecture by Professor Sassen on the issues of democracy and in current times, and political economics, and followed by a conversation between her and myself, and you can write your questions in the chat box, which I will translate to Professor Sassen, and she can answer. And I will hand the talk to you, Saskia.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity, and I thank you very much, Talia, for the invitation and the very generous introduction. And I'm just hoping that people can hear me well. Yes?
Everything's good. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I was going to, I sort of want to focus on work that I'm doing right now, and it contains certainly a critique of our current period. It's not too difficult, I would argue, to find negative critical elements in our current economies. But I want to just focus on certain questions that have to do with how we have handled notions of intelligence and the new intelligent systems. And so one way of starting, perhaps, is to say that the first phase of intelligent cities, in quotation marks, is exciting. The city sort of becomes a living laboratory for smart urban technologies that can handle all the major systems a city requires, supposedly. Water, transport, security, garbage, green buildings, clean energy, and more. The work of installing, experimenting, discovering, all this more can generate innovations, both practical and those that exist mainly in the minds sort of weekend scientists, if you want. But even that is okay. The question I explore here is quite particular. Rather than focusing on the amazing innovations, I want to explore the role, I want to sort of engage in an interrogation, if you want. To what extent the role of technology as a driver of urban innovation can actually have the effect of de-urbanizing the city, which I see as a negative. Let me just be very clear on that. And by this, I mean that as technologies allow communication across vast distances, the narrower engagement of citizens with particular urban spaces can begin to diminish. So I see a tension there, and this is a tension that I will return to. We're just beginning to understand how this can affect urbanity. Most simply by the fact that neighbors matter less as you can be in constant connection with good old friends, both those who live a few blocks away and those who are at the other end of the planet. So there is something both very attractive, very effective, but also it contains within it, as most complex systems do, something that I would read as a negative. At its worst, I see a shift from open source urbanisms to a managed space where censored with an S, censored, can too easily become censored with a C. You know the difference, right? One way of putting it is that what stands out is the extent to which these technologies have not been sufficiently urbanized. So I'm here holding accountable to these brilliant, developers of new technologies, but at least some of them should be focusing on what are ways in which we can maximize the advantages of these new technologies for your average citizen, your average family, your grandmother, your daughter, whatever, and not just focusing on, it's not enough to just develop more and more extraordinary innovations. There's got to be a transversal vector that really takes into account people, we humans. So one way of putting it again is that what stands out is, to me at least, the extent to which these technologies have not been sufficiently urbanized. The project, in other words, you could say, is how do we urbanize a whole variety of really admirable technological innovations, but we want to urbanize them, at least some of them, not everything. And we need the other formats too. But we also need the urbanizing of these technologies, which means also dealing with people of all sorts, intelligent, not intelligent, young, old, rich, poor. That is the challenge. And that, I would argue, is a challenge that these brilliant technologies and the brilliant people who are developing them have sort of left aside. So one way then of saying it is that while these technologies were understood to offer us the advantage of not needing to be close to others, you know, that can be good and that can be bad. And further, in many ways, it may be wonderful for some of us, and in other ways, it cannot be that at all. So there is some extreme set of conditions in play with these brilliant technologies, these such smart elements, etc., that sort of leaves me, there is a void there. There is something that we need to fill. It's not enough to develop a brilliant machine. There has to be, if it's going to involve people, if it's about a city, if it's about a neighborhood, it's about people. There's going to be something more that needs to be put in play. So while these technologies, again, offer us the advantage of not needing to be close to others, and this is very helpful, in many ways, we also need those other ways of interacting. One sort of example that comes to mind for me is that from experimentation, discovery, and open source urbanism, three positives, I would say, we could slide, so to speak, into a managed space where censored with S becomes censored with C. Censored with S is a positive. Censored with C is a control mechanism. So there's a delicate balance between those two, and they sound the same, in English at least. Maybe in your language, you know, it's a bit clearer separation. Now, so what stands out is well captured that prior comment, that is, to what extent have these technologies not been sufficiently urbanized? So salespeople coming from the tech side, for instance, they often fail to understand the complexities and ambiguities of a major city. I'm sure that many of you have run into this. The by now classic cases, of course, are Masdar and Songdo. Notably, their visual orders make them look like they're very different, as you all know, which they are not quite. They are not quite as different as the looks of them. You compare Dubai and London, just to take two very different examples. Both have dense centers, but they are built in very different styles. London was built across centuries, and Dubai was built across years. That's the difference. Yet the different technical applications are minor events compared with the long histories of differences that we see in major cities. The challenges of urbanizing technologies, to me, is sort of one of the key themes here. Now, technologies are de-urbanized when they have not been made to work within a particular context. It is not feasible simply to plop down a new technology in an urban space. It's simply, here it is. That's what the salespeople often give you. They plop down these new technologies. That is not going to get us very far. Now, I know Israel is very, very advanced compared with most other countries in the world. So for you, you can see the defects. And at the same time, you also know, you're aware of all the amazing contributions that these technologies make. Now consider the sharply varying kinds of architecture and building types that have evolved around the world in response to the need for increased density. Let's just take this as an example. The whole notion of this increased density that we're all living with. This means that technology systems that might work in one city might not be desirable in others, or would have to be dramatically reworked to be practical elsewhere. We need to push this urbanizing of technology further and in different directions. Second point, technological systems, such as those that might be proposed nowadays as part of a smart cities program, can actually have the effect of de-urbanizing an urban condition. Why? Because even though they might be interactive, they tend to be closed systems, a point on which I want to elaborate later in this text, but it's a very important point. The capacity of these innovations to function as closed systems, that I find problematic. It's a negative. We need to go beyond that. If we take seriously the notion that cities are open and incomplete systems, this is my definition of a city, an open and incomplete system. And so if we take this notion seriously, then we can understand the massive histories, innovations, spaces, contestations, inclusions, and expulsions that mark the history of any major city. That can easily get lost if we're just obsessing with the technologies. The salespeople who go to municipal governments and all they can talk about are what all these technologies can do, rather than understanding something that those technologies need to be inserted in complex systems that have nothing to do with those technologies, but they can benefit from those technologies. But the systems are different types of systems, and they also include humans, people. Forces such as the rapid expansion of massive surveillance of citizens in the most advanced democracies across the world are powerful factors. On the one hand, they can enable security of residents, but on the other, they can silence the speech or the voice of the city. Here it's a way of speaking, right? The notion that a city has speech and voice. I will return to that. But on the other hand, they can silence the speech or the voice of the city and destroy urban capabilities. Cities are covered, so to say, by urban capabilities. Now here is a second element, cityness, the whole question of the city, but transformed into something that is a bit more abstract than a city. So in that sense, I use this language of cityness. Cityness and notions of smartness. You know, the language of smartness is all over the place, and so it needs to be engaged, I find. Instead of relying on technology as a barometer of urban progress, I prefer a focus on how the residents of a city experience the daily routines of life in their city. In Tokyo, for instance, the basic elements that make a city function are there, and they're all working. In much of the world, a major city may have started well, but then is allowed to decay bit by bit across the decades and more. I would say that New York City is a very good example of this, the second case. With rare exceptions, time shows the decay of what may have been built with good intentions to enable a city's people. Now, I say with rare exceptions, I mean because so much of what gets built is not built with the good intention of enabling the people. It is usually enabling some other interests above the needs that people may have. I coined the notion of cityness to mark something more encompassing and complex than the urban condition as we see it sort of day after day. Cityness is one way of opening up the category and allowing for more variability in what constitutes urbanity. I think in our major systems, this notion of opening up the category of the city or cityness becomes more and more important because we have greater and greater mixes of residents, certainly in our major cities. So cityness, I repeat, is one way of opening up the category of the city, the urban, and allowing for more variability in what constitutes urbanity. We have often we in the West have very narrow definitions of urbanity, basically Western style histories. We need to open that up. There are so many other versions. Many poor countries with limited options have nonetheless worked at making their cities into reasonably safe spaces for their residents, even if an outsider might see those cities as seriously problematic and probably dangerous. Many of the streets, in particular neighborhoods, in Chicago or New York, just to mention two major cities in the United States, cities like Chicago and New York are far more dangerous than streets in poor neighborhoods, in poor countries. I mean, in Chicago, every day, mostly at night, several people get shot, they get killed in fights or by police or whatever. That's pretty extreme. How to read the street in a city that we do not know well is a whole art in itself, and I'm sure that many of you have had that experience. This mix of conditions generates a field for research and interpretation and invites us to reposition Western notions of what cities should look like and to explore a far broader range of building technologies and designing urban spaces. I think this is essential. In a city like New York, we very often have the sort of things that we have been doing for 30 years and are not great. And just the builders or whatever, the designers, they just stick with that. That's sort of an error. I think your city is much more active in that sense and much more proactive. The city is not just materiality. It contains people, practices, subcultures, a conglomerate of conditions. Thus, with the concept of cityness, I seek to convey the fact that also a very poor, small town can contain within it the elements of cityness. At its best, this contract that allows us to interpret urban space as a capability. And I want to repeat that. This notion of thinking about this construct that allows us to interpret urban space itself as a capability. We tend to not think of it that way. We tend to think of urban space as just that sort of dead space that we then occupy, we walk on, or whatever. But when we think of urban space as a capability, we're thinking of a complex space that thrives on diversities and has the extraordinary capability to triage conflicts into a strengthened civicness. I would say that this is what marks a city. A city is a complex space that can thrive on diversities and that has the extraordinary capability to triage conflicts into a strengthened civicness. In many ways, if you look at our old histories, old cities, you can see that accepting the other, always a major issue, and the other comes in many different shapes, and sometimes what was the other 10 years ago is now a member, and the newcomer is the other, etc., etc. But this is something that we cannot let go, this notion that a city has the capability to triage conflicts into a strengthened civicness. Not just simply civicness, but it strengthens civicness. It is precisely those diversities that force the city, or you go under. But if you don't want to go under, you're going to have to keep opening it up to new types of people who might come, etc., etc. Such capabilities get constituted often as hybrids. We don't even have a name for them. Sort of mixes of the material and social. The launching, oh, I have a problem here, I'm really sorry. Just 1 second. Okay. So a second element is the whole question that I am very interested in, which is the physics of a city. Physics as in physics. In other words, cityness can capture the ways in which an urban space expresses its civic intelligence, manifests its unique characteristics, and negotiates threats and conflicts. Now that was a big sentence, I know. So such, I will repeat it because it matters to my analysis here. So such capabilities get constituted as hybrids. That is to say, mixes of the material and the social physics of a city. In other words, cityness captures the ways in which an urban space expresses its civic intelligence, manifests its unique characteristics, and negotiates threats and conflicts. Now that's a very long list of good things that a city can do. To take it a step further, cityness produces an urban space that talks back, say that in quotation marks. A civic space, an urban space that can talk back. In other words, that the city, actually the complexity that it contains within it also a kind of knowledge. And that's a knowledge that in one way or another talks back. It lets you know in its own way. It's through materialities. It's through when something goes wrong in a very crowded setting. So that's a negative, etc. Many, many instantiations of daily life in a major city actually one can think of as a way when something goes wrong that the city is talking back and saying, no, that's not the way we're going to do it. The city spaces contain their own ecologies, thereby signaling a notion of urban intelligence that is derived from the intersection of people, places, activities, and resources, not merely the presence of cutting-edge technology. Cutting-edge technology we need, it's great, we want it. But there are many other modalities and many other, if you want, forceful actors and modes in which the city enables. And they are a critical part of the whole operation. When I use the term ecology, writing on the digital, when I'm writing about digital things, I use this term ecology to capture the fact that in interactive digital domains, one should not think that all that happens is simply a function of the technology. We have a tendency, certainly in the United States, maybe in your very smart country, you don't fall in that trap. But the notion is that given that the technology exists, given that the technology can do all kinds of things, there is a sense in which, say, an interactive digital domain that, of course, contains all kinds of people with different knowledges, etc., etc., and to think that all of what happens in that domain is simply a function of the technology, simply a mistake. It is also about the people. The technology can enable the communications, etc., etc. So I argue that a larger ecology of meanings installs itself in that digital interactive domain than simply the technology that is involved. There is much more that can that can happen and is enabled by the technology, but is not the technology per se. It is generated by the cultures, the politics, the ideas, the art, whatever it is. And the way people communicate online, where they live, where they work, a whole combination of vast, never-ending sort of set of conditions, of connections, of ideas that emerge, of little fights, the good and the bad. So digital interactions cannot be reduced to technical capacities. This is a key point for me, that it is too easily we think, there is a techne, we're set. No, the techne is the techne, that's fine, but it will vary enormously across different cities, inside cities, but in different neighborhoods, different people. So it's très mouvementé, we might say, or the French might say. These are pretty standardized nowadays and are similar across the world. In other words, these technical capacities, we can see them replicate in different parts of the world. So in that sense, they are very standardized and they're often very similar. But the social fabric that gets constituted in a city, even with those technologies, that can vary enormously across different parts of the world. So yes, the technology is very standardized, but the cultural side of us humans is not as standardized as the technology can be. I mean, sometimes it's the other way around, but anyhow, it's also the case that that we humans can contribute an extraordinary variety of modes of interpreting, modes of acting, modes of communicating, etc., etc. And the city can enable that. And at the same time, the practices, the particular practices in a given city, of course, add to specificities of cities. That is why even if the technologies and the instruments that are used to build, etc., are often the same across many different parts of the world, the city itself can actually be different. And I really think that is an important point to recognize, that in our complex worlds, where we have a lot of very advanced instruments that are in one way or another shared across the world, that all cities have some of these big machines that they need for this or for that, etc., etc. The way we build tracks, the way, transport and all of that. And this, at the same time, in every city, there is something that makes it different. What it is exactly is not always clear, but I think that that's partly also our role in those cities, how we can make a difference in terms of how we think, how we talk, what we like, what we hate, how we conduct ourselves. So there is, yes, a powerful infrastructure in play, and then there is a powerful superstructure in play, which is us humans. And we are not perfect, we're very far from perfect, but we can be innovators, we can want it differently, and we can grow in long and old traditions that make a city or a neighborhood different. Now, I want to come back to this notion of speech, which is a basic expression of intelligence, and my argument that a city has speech. And really what I want to get at is this notion that the city has an ability to talk back. We may not notice it, we may not be thinking about that, but in a way, how it is built, what we cannot do, what it gives us, what it stops us from doing, etc. One way of thinking about it, I find that stimulating, is this notion that the city has the ability to talk back to us, to let us know in its own ways, no, niet, that you're not going to do. And I like this image that I want to read you now. think of a big city, think of a car, an automobile, a car built for speed, is on the highway at great speed, exits the highway and enters the city. It hits a traffic jam composed not just of cars, but of people bustling around. Suddenly, this car is crippled. Built for speed, its mobility is arrested. In my view, the way I see it, the city has spoken. So when you begin to think of the city as containing all these variable elements that are constitutive, some very strongly so, others not, but they are constitutive, they shape us. We learn how to conduct ourselves by living in a city. We recognize it's different from living in a village, etc., etc. Another way of examining this issue, as I'm calling it, of cityness, is to look at neighborhoods or localities in cities. When I emphasize their importance to a city, the importance of neighborhoods and localities for a city, and how different the neighborhoods in a city can be, I'm saying also that this is, and I'm saying it as a core proposition, and that is that cities are complex but incomplete systems, as I said at the beginning. And the diversity and specificity of neighborhoods and localities make for a flexible tissue that will have a much longer life than a huge mega project built for very specific uses. So if you think of some of the neighborhoods that have existed for centuries and centuries, of course they have changed, the buildings have changed, etc. But we really have in many older cities, especially in Europe and in Asia, in certain parts of Asia, not so much in the Americas, which is a much newer world, of course. But it's quite extraordinary how certain modes have been, still exist. It's different. And that also then marks, of course, the specificity that cities can bring to our lives. Cities are different. Even if all the cars that you can see in them are more or less the same, and the buses are more or less the same, etc., there is something else in play for which we often lack a name or a designation. Now, so I was just beginning to also bring in this question of the neighborhood. So another way of examining cityness is to look at neighborhoods or localities in cities. When I emphasize their importance to a city, in other words, the importance of neighborhoods and localities, which can be very poor neighborhoods or very rich neighborhoods, but both matter. So when I emphasize their importance to a city and how different the neighborhoods in a city can be, I am saying this as a core proposition. Cities are complex but incomplete systems, and the diversity and specificity of neighborhoods and localities make for a flexible tissue that will have a much longer life than a huge mega project built for very specific uses. And that's just one little comparison. You could add a very long list of these comparisons between cities and the city as entity and all the varieties of technologies, etc., that we have. And so the flexible tissue that will have a much longer life, I repeat, than a huge mega project built for specific uses, which of course that mega project is also likely to at some point be simply useless because the technology is past or whatever, but the city is still there. And a lot of what we have in cities are very old constructions. So it's sort of when you begin to really think about it, you can see it's sort of interesting to what extent a city is a city is a city, and it can be that in many different ways, the same city across millennia. I mean, that's quite something. Now, so again, what the comparison, that the city can have a much longer life than a huge mega project that is built for specific uses. And that is also why the launching of massive development projects can be quite unsettling to residents in those city areas, and even in areas of the city where they rarely go. Development projects in major cities can bring about massive concentrations of costs and extensive unsettlement of affected neighborhoods. Japan went through a period of massive construction that brought both beautiful buildings and many expulsions of modest income residents from their neighborhoods. I was there, I spent a lot of time in Japan, and it was extraordinary how they moved into all kinds of neighborhoods and just erased them. I mean, they let the people get out. They didn't also erase the people, but they expelled the people first and then they erased the towns. Now, Japan, of course, has very little space. It's a huge population. They are they're leading innovators. So, of course, they have the talents, the machineries, the notions of how to rebuild. And frankly, when I was there, I was impressed also at how fast they rebuilt. And it was serious rebuilding. It was not. But in one night, for instance, they would destroy something and then rebuild it. It was just rebuild parts of it begin, because you need much more time than that to build. Now, when I was doing my research on the global city, and which is a book that I focused on New York, London, and Tokyo, I spent quite a bit of time in Japan, and it was for me an ordinary experience. And I remember that I dedicated my book to the coalition of the homeless of Tokyo. In other words, there were a lot of poor people also in Tokyo. They are a bit invisible. We don't really see them. But when you enter into certain neighborhoods, you see them. And I was very impressed with how the homeless created a coalition, and that gave them a ground from which to fight. We barely see that in the West, I would say, where we have a lot of poor people and homeless people in our cities, but we don't see them organized in that way. Now, beginning to conclude here, cities have partly had these very long lives because they are complex but incomplete systems. I do think that this is something that is rarely said. I've never heard anybody else, except from my own voice, notice this. I mean, for me, this is a very, very significant feature, that they're complex but incomplete systems. They have outlived all kinds of more powerful but closed systems. A closed system, of course, is far more likely to die. So corporate firms, governments, etc., powerful bureaucracies, all of that, that definitely has a curve, whereas the city can exist, even though it gets also transformed, of course. Across the centuries, most of these systems no longer exist, but the cities and its neighborhoods, they still exist. That's also good. That's sort of a people's moment, if you want. Even as whole new types of people inhabit those old neighborhoods and elite spaces, but there they are, in those same old neighborhoods. Now, the challenges for local government. Unsurprisingly, this organic, people-centered, and more complex notion of urban intelligence makes the application of modern technology more difficult. And this is something that I'm sure that some of you at least have encountered. And so I just want to repeat it because it's a long sentence. So this organic, people-centered, and more complex notion of urban intelligence makes the application of modern technology more difficult. You can't just plop it down. Although this is not necessarily easy, neither is it rocket science, as they used to say. Depending on the country's level of technical development for major cities, not just small towns, but also major cities. It can be quite extensive and encompassing. Japan is a good example of the latter. It is far more engaged with the use of advanced technologies that enable daily life than is the United States. The United States is really sort of as if they are not very interested in using new technologies. They just are always doing minor repairs, minor sort of camouflaging a change. You know, it looks like a new building or something, but actually it's an old building that they have just painted up a bit. So the United States, really the tech factor is above all about money. And then, of course, fame. But the notion of really building it right, like the Japanese do, for instance, no. However, it does mean dealing with the diversities of cities, this whole story that I'm giving you. The diverse localities and people and institutions and causes and fights among diverse politicians and on and on. This is far more difficult than buying technology from respectable corporations and presenting it to the city's people as, we have now addressed this or that problem. In other words, the leadership of cities would rather not deal with people, but simply buy some of the fancy machines and say, okay, we now have this great machine and everything will be better. For me, this is an important point. It's a negative, clearly. The big tech companies should learn more about what a city actually is before they come and sell their diverse innovations to municipal government. Most municipal governments don't have time to study, to learn about. So they, when they are told, look, this is great, this will solve your problems, etc., then you know, they can't quite handle it. It's a waste of money, basically. So we have seen cases where a municipal government buys all the equipment that the salespeople say it needs, and that it will make all the difference for those governments. But then the corporate salespeople leave, and the municipal government discovers that the types of spaces their municipality would need to install these instruments and machines do not even exist, or they're crumbling, or they fill with water when it rains, or they can be easily accessed by kids doing mischief on the street, etc., etc. So again, some cities don't have that. The Japanese cities are very well, just to mention that example again, very well organized. But in the United States, after all, rich country, and in Latin America, a bit less rich, but still quite rich also, we just don't see a real attempt to maximize knowledge around what would be good acquisitions on the part of these governments. New York City, back in the 1970s and 1980s, was a good example, if you want, of this mix of wanting the latest innovation, but not knowing quite how to use it or what to do with it. And that is, in good part, why it is so important to work with the residents of the diverse neighborhoods of a city, to mobilize their intelligence and knowledge. They know what all is not working in their neighborhoods. Now, I like to illustrate this situation by referring to by now a famous incident, I mean a famous development, which is very little, a pothole application. I don't know if you have heard of it. Maybe that is not a good idea, but it is a pretty example in the sense that something very little, you know, the potholes, I don't know if you have them in your country, probably not, but we certainly have them in New York. When you have a hole, you know, that should not be there on the road. And so a municipal government, in this case, the Boston municipal government, developed a pothole app. Every owner of a car received that application for free. And you could, as soon as they detected a pothole, say after the winter, you know, and the snow and all of that had created a hole in the street, immediately you could click on that, and you can still do that. You click on that and the municipal government then knows, okay, here is, on this particular street, on this particular part of the street, is a pothole. Because potholes can really break a car, they can break a bike, they can break your neck if you are on a bike and you wind up. So these little innovations can just make a wonderful difference. Now, another needed change in how sort of municipal governments are managing things should drive the conversations with providers. I come back to that subject. Rather than simply be told by those who are trying to sell them materials that they should, just buy that stuff. So after all, the providers are in the business of selling. These providers are in the business of selling. And that is a dominant issue for them, not necessarily what the city needs. I have long argued that these meetings between corporations and municipal governments should reverse the usual roles. Typically, the tech people come and impress the municipal government people with all the things the new systems can do. They also assume that the municipal government people know little about tech. It should be the other way around. The municipal government should keep asking questions. What does this do for the city? Will it solve this problem we face? And if so, show us how, and so on. Building or maintaining a city is in itself a daunting proposition. But I find the biggest challenge is more conceptual. It is the need to design a system that puts all that technology truly at the service of the inhabitants and not the other way around. And I leave you with that thought, and I hope we can have a bit of a discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. I can't hear you.
Thank you.
All right.
I think I will skip to the questions from the audience because we have very interesting questions and
yes,
not so much time left. So I will just go one by one. And I thank the audience for the beautiful questions. And I will start with Professor Noida Fassi, who writes, do you see the chat, or I will read it on? I will read it on. Thank you. This is a very interesting question. When you refer to the unique way a city deals with standard technology, do you actually speak of culture?
Can you, I can't hear you well. Can you repeat that?
Okay. When you refer to the unique way a city deals with standard technology, do you actually speak of culture?
Well, culture. Culture, is culture the word? Yeah, I mean, culture is a complex category, and culture in its own way will always be present in the making of a city, in the making of a building, etc., etc. But there are forms of culture that we don't recognize, like our own cultures. We may think that's just a building that is being built, but it is our kind of building. So we think, okay, a building is a building. Whereas if you have a city with many different nationalities and newcomers from other countries, they may not see it that way. So to me, it's sort of the self-evident character of the city you live in marks also your understanding very easily of what a city looks like. You know, and we just have to accept that cities come in many, many different shapes, in many, many different modalities. So that is sort of my comment on that.
Okay, next question for Professor Tori Fenster. Can you elaborate on cityness and diseases like our current pandemic, COVID-19?
Cityness?
How do you see? Yeah.
I hear you very, very badly.
And diseases like COVID-19.
Cityness and what?
And diseases, the pandemic.
I can't understand it. I can't understand your what.
let me give
it
it a try. Can you hear me better? Excuse me,
Yeah,
Talia.
I hear you better. I hear you better.
Okay. So I'll just read the questions that Talia was just reading by Professor Toby Fenster from Tel Aviv University. Can you elaborate on cityness and diseases such as COVID-19?
Cityness and the virus, right? Okay. With the concept of cityness, what I'm trying to capture is a somewhat complex tissue that gets constituted in a city, and that if it works well, it can enable people. So given that definition, I would say that the virus is this virus, silent, no smell, no noise, but a killer. It's quite extraordinary. That's what we were talking about, right? The virus, yes? Or,
right.
Yes?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So the virus is a completely different actor in all of this, right? So the city becomes one site, clearly, for the virus, but the virus is also present in other types of spaces. Now, what the virus seems to have succeeded at is two things very well. One is killing people. It really has succeeded at that in an extraordinary way, one could say. The other one is that it has put up front something that we need to confront, which is that, a city has very severe limits in terms of handling life, our lives. We are in charge of our lives to some extent, and we need to understand, we need to accept that something like this virus is truly dangerous. And I don't know if you read, but in the United States, for the longest time, a lot of people in certain areas of the United States simply didn't take it seriously. And of course, many died. And so just because this virus is invisible, has no smell, and makes no noise, does not mean that we are exempt from recognizing here is a danger that we've got to deal with. There is, of course, philosophically speaking, one might then ask, well, besides the virus, what are the other instantiations where we are not paying attention? Partly because it is not a virus that kills, but it's something else. And in this case, I would say that neglecting, and the United States, of course, is very seriously bad about this, as is Latin America, and that is really neglecting the poorer sectors of our cities and allowing them to get ill. For instance, that would be a dramatic thing, right? So they get ill, so they can become contagious, all kinds of illnesses. So there is a kind of stupidity that hangs in there besides cruelty and indifference. And so I would say between those three things, cruelty, indifference, and stupidity, that yes, there is a case to be made to pay more attention to all of that. And again, if I were a poet, this virus would be my mate, a real mate. I don't mean maid as in the cleaning woman. I mean mate as a friend, somebody in a strange way. The virus is teaching us a few things. It's showing the limits of power, the limits of wealth, the limits. I mean, the poor do much worse than the rich, but even the rich get caught. So there is a tale to be told, and I'm sure that we will have poets and people who are good about writing about this, that will give this virus a certain kind of literary presence. We will not forget it easily. I mean, remember the SARS, of the 1980s. Many people have totally forgotten that. I haven't, because for me it was really fascinating. But anyhow, so I could go on and on, so stop me.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yeah?
Good. I change the microphone. Okay, a question from Dr. Efrat Livatal from our School of Architecture. She's asking, taking as an example Toronto Waterfront Project and leaving aside the fact that it was cancelled, what do you think will be the role of urban planners or designers in a world where cities are being planned by information scientists?
Well, I mean, the role of planners and architects also includes, you know, some of these advanced technologies. I mean, not all planners, but many do. We are running a risk. Certainly, I've seen this in some countries in the West. I don't know about your country, where we have delegated too much the knowledge function to companies, to firms that deal with very advanced technologies. I think we have to handle that far more intelligently than we have thus far, typically. Maybe in some countries it's much better than in others. But I would say that in the United States, for instance, and in Latin America, I grew up in Latin America, you can really see how big firms can come to municipal governments and tell them, buy this, buy that, and you know, they then fall for it. These municipal governments easily fall for it. I think in your country the story is probably quite different, but I don't know that for a fact. But there are parts of the world which are sufficiently, it's not quite poor, but they haven't bought much advanced instruments, so that becomes a major sort of issue, and they may often think that, oh my God, if we get this, it will solve so many of our problems. Whereas those who have dealt with the buying of many instruments know by now the limits of those instruments, no matter how they are described.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Ravit Hananel, Dr. Ravit Hananel from the Public Policy Department, also in Tel Aviv University. And she's saying, thank you so much for the fascinating lecture. I want to ask about the significance of technology for different population groups within the city. Do you think the use of technology can help reduce disparities between different population groups, or does it reinforce existing socioeconomic disparities?
Well, you know, technology brings both. It can really make a difference. We know that in poor neighborhoods in New York City, once a municipal government decided, okay, let's connect them to reasonable connectivity, right? Rather than this very these old-fashioned systems, it made a difference. I mean, it doesn't make all the needed differences, but it makes a difference. So there is no doubt about that. But what we must recognize is the limits of these technologies. These technologies operate in a certain, if you want, zone or space, and they cannot address all kinds of other negative conditions that lower income people or poorer neighborhoods may have. So, you know, there is a limit. Even if you bring in connectivity, the way the poor, the really, really poor are going to use that connectivity is likely to have less significant, say, socioeconomic outcomes for them than it would if you are a middle-class person, you know, who can make the most out of it. I mean, I think that the whole question in the United States, now half of the population in most major cities is really poor, partly poor because it's so expensive to live in those cities. I mean, we really have significant crises growing of poor people and a middle class that has divided into two classes, you know, a very impoverished group of people and a middle class, and a second half of the middle class that is richer than they ever thought they would be. So we have, in my reading, as I mentioned at the start, we have entered a new epoch when it comes to cities. It's just that so many of the familiar functions remain in that play, and they may have gone through transformations, but not everything changes. You know, how do we recognize genuine change in complex systems? And a city is a complex system with all kinds of different systems in it. So it's very difficult to capture that. And it is something that we need also more research about, I would say.
Okay, next question from Professor Niftarel of Ben Gurion University. Thanks for the lecture, and thanks for raising the tech issue. However, what about the impact on of privatization of personal data through the PPP in big data management? What about the danger to democracy through the temptation of smart cities? Are we losing control of the new frontiers, frontier of urban management? I'm trying to, okay, to uncountable private and political forces?
Well, I mean, we can, number one, you know, we cannot romanticize all these new technologies. We have to be sober about it. We have to be smart about it. Number two, cities are spaces that contain, and perhaps increasingly in some parts of the world, extraordinary levels of inequality. I mean, it's just shocking what is happening in some cities. And I'm thinking there also of New York. New York City, it's just astounding. The range between a lot of very poor, lowly paid workers, etc., and the top. You know, this is grotesque it's unacceptable. We cannot do that. The concentration of wealth in some of the major cities in the world today is huge. And it's more wealth than they will ever be able to use, so to say. And so why not generate modes where there is a bit of more redistribution? So for me, the United States is really exhibit number one on the negative vector. I am not impressed at all. I mean, there are good people, there are good planners, there are people who really mean well, but overall, it is a city marked by extraordinary inequalities and unnecessary and a kind of poverty that should not be there. We know that we have many people in New York City who don't have enough food. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It is just absolutely unacceptable what is happening. And it's just gotten worse, you know, over the last few years. It's long existed, but it's really gotten worse. And the indifference of the rich is another extraordinary. It's like the more wealth they can accumulate, somehow that is a prize, you know, or that makes them more important or more interesting. It's just unbelievable. I mean, if I had that kind of money, I know that what I don't need, I would just simply give to people so they can buy food. It's as basic as that. It's not even about getting a better house. No, it's food. We have more and more people in our cities who go to bed hungry. And then you have this extraordinary concentration of wealth on the other hand. And yeah, for me, it is unacceptable.
Okay, just a minute. I have two more questions here. Trying.
Oh, I see Oren Yiftafeld.
Yeah.
Hi there.
So Oren has another question to you. In your book, Expulsion, you painted an alarming scenario of growing population becoming displaceable and evictable. What are the options for urban residents to resist the negative impact of the land and housing regime? Yeah. However, are there good examples of cities with good system housing security that manage taking over the public realm?
Well, you know, this is my reading of the matter is that we're running into serious trouble when it comes to housing, reasonable lives, reasonable trips, the length of trips by low-income workers to get to their jobs, you know, that will require a lot of changes. Number two, I think we have to stop enabling the massive and endless expansion of major cities that goes on. The rich don't notice. For them, it's fine. It's for the lower income people who have to get up 2 hours earlier than the rich to get to their jobs, because etc. I don't need to elaborate on this, right? To me, our leadership should take notice of the fact that these endlessly expanding cities are to the enormous disadvantage of the lower income classes. They never get to sleep enough, etc., etc. I mean, to me, it is unacceptable that in a rich country like the United States, that we are enabling that. Number 3, we have to build new cities. Now, we don't think of that. When I see my students, for example, my students assume that, well, we have built the cities, that it's done. No, if we grow our populations, we need to build new cities. We can't just simply keep on adding to existing cities. That is a nightmare scenario for those who then are at the edges. And you see it. Again, I grew up in Latin America. In Latin America, you see extreme conditions. I mean, it really is a problematic issue, the lower income people. So I think we need to build new cities. And it is something I can notice that, sometimes I'll say that at a dinner party or at a lecture, and it's like people react like saying, build new cities, but we built the cities. We have done it. We have built, there's this notion that we have built cities, we're done with that. And no, we're not. And I don't believe at all in these endless extensions. So we should just build new cities. But there's just nothing that promises that will happen in the West. Maybe, in some countries in Asia and the Middle East, etc., there is a bit of that, but certainly not in the West. It's just extraordinary. Or in Europe, we're done with cities. We've done it. And that's sort of an interesting invitation too. No, we're not done, is what people should be shouting.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Zev Lipan to Professor Sassen. Thank you for your profound insight of the cityness and its modalities. When you discuss the cityness and its modalities, with the complexities of the localities and their influence and contribution to the city, my inquiry is, if and how do you take into account the factor of scale, the scale of the size of the city, the scale of the inhabitants number, etc.? And I wonder, how does that factor of scale differs in reference to culture that the city is immersed in? E.g., assuming that the issues of American culture and New York City are different from another place, such as the Nordic Finnish culture and Helsinki City, etc.
Yeah, well, he said it all. These are all very different conditions, very different situations. And there are, I think Europe in many ways has been far more reasonable than the Americas. Well, also the Canadians, but they are always reasonable, the Canadians, but Americans are not. So I think that there is really serious work to be done. We are running into a certain type of catastrophic unsettlement. And I think we're already beginning to see elements of it. And it has to do with a growing number of people who can no longer coexist in cities, mostly the poor people. And Latin America, again, is exhibit number 1 here, because there's a lot of that, but certain parts of Africa are also. And so you have a genuine impoverishment of the poor. Yes, they start as poor, but then they lose whatever little they have. And we have more and more, we call them the homeless, we got different names and but people who simply have nothing. They have nothing left. And we are not addressing that in a serious, sustainable way that also enables those people. Many of those people are very smart. They could be doing certain types of jobs. So I think we are confronting a crisis that for now has no name. And but it basically for me, it's these two vectors, that I described. One is the cost of housing and all of that, a familiar theme. The other one is the fact that many of our cities are too big, and it's to the disadvantage of the poor, of the lower income. We must build new cities. But you say that, and besides, somewhere in the Middle East and in some areas where, okay, we built a new city, they have built some new cities. I mean, in the West, it's like I said before, when you really pay attention, give it a try sometime at dinner, with friends. You say, yeah, we need to build new cities. The typical reaction is, but we built the cities. Like it's done. The work has been done. And at best, an extension of an existing city. No, like in the United States, we now have a few cities that are far too big, and it's to the disadvantage of the workers who are poor. The rich, they don't notice it. They don't even think about the fact that the worker has to spend 2 hours to get to the shop, and then the worker doesn't function as well as she could, etc. Right? I mean, there really is those who don't focus on cities, let's say, they really think that, okay, we built the cities, we built the canals, done. How do you get these people out of that mindset?
Okay, I have another question here from Professor Sai Klaus from our School of Architecture. Could such a discussion using different technical terms take place when the car started taking over the public realm? Maybe it is an unstoppable process of humanity?
Well, I mean, cars, in many ways in the West now, you see more and more of the young generations, they don't want to own a car. They want to have access to a car, but it could be a rental car or whatever. They don't want to deal with a car that you need to regularly bring for fixing, that you need to put the oil in, that you need to change the wheels or whatever. I mean, they don't want it. And so I think that is also interesting, they want to have access to a car, but they don't want to own a car. And so I'm the way, my husband and I, we have not owned a car for 30 years, but hey, we have car service, right? So, but it's a little better than owning a car, I would say. But we should also, and you see that in some cultures, say in the Netherlands, the bike, right? They use bikes or some version of a modest motorbike. And in many ways, that is far more sensible than one person sitting in a big car occupying a lot of space on the street, right? And multiply that. So I do think that the culture is changing, I would argue. That is one way of putting it. The culture regarding cars is changing. I know of more and more young professionals who want to have a car service that they can always count on, that is always perfectly, nicely cleaned, that they don't have to deal with. Now, the working classes, when they buy a car, for them it's still, a major event. They love the car, etc. But the important point to notice is the extent to which those who have money, I don't mean the super rich, I mean, good incomes, they are less and less interested in cars because of the traffic, because of having to fix it, etc., etc. So I do think that that's that to me is a little signal of a change, a significant change. And if you lived, for instance, in certain parts of India where the traffic is hell, owning a car could just add to that hell, I think. But I am now simply chatting here, so I should shut up.
Okay, I think this is the last question from the audience, and I will ask question I wanted to ask all along. And then Ran has a question and we'll call it a night. I wanted to ask you, how do you see the connections between this deepening inequalities and the state of democracy today?
Yeah. Well, I think, look, democracy was always imperfect, right? Democracy has gone, the whole concept of democracy has gone through extraordinary ups and downs, different histories, etc., right? So we can't throw it out of the window. It simply will come back. You see, I really believe that it is one modality that is quite universal, and that comes in many, many, many different shapes. In other words, there is enormous ambiguity that attaches to the term democracy, but still it has certain components that we recognize. So that sort of, you know, that's going to keep on going. My reading is, number one, if you look at long histories, in one of my books, I went through a lot of long histories. No formal system of power lasts forever, and certainly doesn't remain effective. So the question is, are we already now beginning to notice that something is changing? We already have a lower opinion of democracy, of this kind of democratic system, that consists of elections and all of that. But we are already sensing, I would say, in some countries, certainly in the United States, the decay of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy had a much better moment, you know, decades ago than it does now. So now we can still keep on calling it all liberal democracy. You know, very difficult to get rid of that. And certainly those with power think that all sounds good. Liberal democracy sounds good, etc. So they can keep on maximizing inequality. But sooner or later, I think we will begin to see, and I think I already sense that in the new generations now, see that something here is not working. Something doesn't work anymore. It may have worked after World War I and II, but it doesn't work anymore today. And I think we're at that stage. We know that something is either rotten, or it's ineffective, or we have too many people who are poor, and that the notion of democracy, it fails to capture a growing list of negatives. And so we can keep on using the term democracy, demos, you know, it has these strong positive meanings, but it is a changed animal, I would say. Now, it varies from country to country, you know, that is also the case. But certainly the Americas are among the more brutal areas in the world. Huh? I mean, the Americas are really brutal, all the Americas. So, I mean, the kind of social injustice is rampant. I mean, just rampant. I could go on and on, but you know,
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
we are entering familiar terrain, and it's time for a drink. I don't know where you are at time-wise. It must be pretty late.
Yes, well, it's 8:30 p.m. here, and I would like to thank you for a very important talk and ideas that you conveyed in the last hour and a half. I was very glad to see here many students and many colleagues joining us tonight. And I have one final question. I take the liberty, you know, having been hosting this event, I want to ask you something which spoke my mind during your talk, because you were talking about the relationship between the scale of the city, you know, its size, and as you elaborate a little bit right now about, and in relation to democracy, and it seems that the bigger the city is, the less democratic it is, because, you know, the citizens has less opportunities, or maybe they have more opportunities, but they cannot exploit them or cannot use them. And so one question would be, what is the ideal size of a city in order to supply the right conditions for a good citizenship, or fair citizenship for diverse communities? This is one thing. And then another, we're also talking about the need for new cities.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about the balance between the need for new cities and also the need to be more ecological, and maybe we should densify our cities. So how does that work? The balance between more cities and the ecological problems that we are facing globally.
Yeah, well, when I spoke about we need new cities, the notion here is also cities built under very different concepts from the ones that we have sort of been using a lot in the West. In other words, and if you look, for instance, I mentioned it sort of in passing, but in Japan, they are building continuously, and they build a lot of very tall buildings because they don't have a lot of team at work with me, as I would say, right? So we can build in ways. I mean, any building is going to destroy something, right? Land, water, whatever. But we don't need to do it the way we do it, say, in the United States, where a lot of construction is truly low quality. All kinds of advanced modes are simply, they don't even know that they exist. Some of these developers, I mean, it's just shocking, the ignorance that they have. And it's all, the cheaper the better for them, because they don't care. Because once they're done with building, if the building then falls apart, I mean, I must say there are certain parts in India where it's even worse, how buildings simply, they just collapse. But really, and you have to ask, why is this such a degraded cultures that we see emerging, where there is a lack of interest in building. It's all about money in some situations. There's a kind of, one way of thinking about it, and that is sort of a way that I think about it, is that we are witnessing the decay of a culture. A Western culture, etc. We're really witnessing its decay. Yes, there are still people who are making a lot of money. Yes, there are still marvelous universities, all of that. But somewhere there is a beating heart that is simply decaying. It's just, I mean, in the United States, we have in most of our major cities, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who have retired from jobs, and maybe they are, 60 years old, and they can no longer afford housing. They're on the street. I mean, you have to stand back and say, okay, a few things, not just one thing, a few things are going wrong here. Something is truly failing. Well, one language which has been used historically across ages is the decay of a culture. And I think in many ways, we are seeing elements of it. It's not that everything is in decay. It's that decay is ascendant, is one way of putting it. And I don't know, I am just really alarmed. I am quite alarmed.
Yes.
Well, on this happy note, we are thanking Professor Sassen so much for a marvelous evening and a very interesting talk, and for being with us. And
yeah, thank you very much, Professor Sassen. And thank you also, Talia, for leading this evening and for inviting Professor Sassen. And thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you in the next event. Have a good night, evening, morning, wherever you are. And a Happy New Year. And we hope that 2021 will be a better year. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Sassen.
Very nice.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.